This is John Dravinsky, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Professor Charles McKinney, author of the 2010 book Greater Freedom, The Evolution of Civil Rights Struggle in Wilson, North Carolina, and the co-editor of two fantastic volumes, An Unseen Light, Black Struggles for Freedom in Memphis, Tennessee, with Aram Goudsouzian from 2018, and the recently released From Rights to Lives, The Evolution of Black Freedom Struggle with Francoise Hamlin. McKinney is an historian by training and is one of the founding faculty members of the Department of Africana Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. Charles McKinney, how are you? It's good to have a chance to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, brother. It's good to be here. Looking forward to chopping it up.
I'm really, this is going to be in our first wave of these podcast pieces on the past future of Black studies. I'm really happy to have you to talk to, first of all, because we're friends. We've talked about these issues a lot. We've worked on Africana Studies founding work, at Rhodes College, where you are, generating your program, also talking about Grinnell College starting a program. So I know how interesting these conversations can be. I was really happy that we were able to find a time to talk about all of this. But before we get into this sort of specific questions about the field of Black studies, I just wanted to sort of invite you to narrate a little bit of your own intellectual journey, both past and present. What is intriguing? What has intrigued you and guided you in your writing and teaching and thinking about Black life? We will obviously talk, extensively about how this relates to the field of Black studies, but I just wanted to hear a sort of sense of your trajectory as a thinker.
Sure. So the thing that I've been most fascinated by, over the course of these past few decades, actually, is the question of how do Black folks build and sustain movements of liberatory movements, right? How do they build and sustain what I'm calling these days liberatory moments of possibility, right? And so, my initial foray into that question was profoundly shaped, both in my undergraduate years at Morehouse, studying with my mentor, Dr. Marcellus Barksdale, who had done work on what he was calling back in the 1980s, the indigenous civil rights movement. Right. His work, his dissertation work at Duke, was on Monroe, North Carolina, right? The home of Robert Williams and one of these early epicenters of the self-defense, nonviolent sort of debates that were raging in the early, throughout the movement, actually. Right. And so Barksdale introduced us to this idea of an indigenous civil rights movement. And he was doing that to counter, this idea that this movement was solely and primarily sort of a top-down phenomenon, right? Granted to us by President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, President Johnson, the master narrative of the civil rights movement, right? Martin King and the Supreme Court and and Thurgood Marshall, saved Black people, right? Yeah. So this piqued my curiosity, right, as an undergrad. And then when I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school and study African American history, I was like, I want to go and do civil rights work, and I'm intrigued by this question of how people build and sustain these movements, right? These moments of liberatory possibility. And I'm interested in what that looks like in rural spaces, right? What does it mean to build a movement in the 1950s and 60s? Martin Luther King ain't coming to your town, right? What does it mean to build a movement? It's not Atlanta, right? You're not in Raleigh. You're not in New York. You're not in Charlotte. You're out in the cut, right? You're out in rural North Carolina for my case, right? So what does that look like when the levels of terror that are normally associated with the Deep South are also sort of resonant with you, right? In the Up South, right? In North Carolina, so on and so forth, right? So that was something that really sort of sustained me for a while, right? So, the dissertation was on the indigenous civil rights movement, to use Barksdale's language, in Wilson County, North Carolina, which then became the first book, Greater Freedom. And so I was there for a moment, right? Sort of exploring this liberatory possibility. Okay, what are people on the ground doing, right? What are school teachers doing? Who are the activists? Who's in the vanguard of political struggle? Oh, well, look, right? These working class Black women. Okay, so then we got to deal with that a little bit, right? So I started doing a little bit of work then on thinking through and thinking about, the really sort of pivotal roles that Black women, working class Black women in particular, are playing in the shaping of these and the shaping and the maintenance, right? And the sustenance of these moments of liberatory possibility. So I spent a little time doing that. Then, year 4 or 5, at Rhodes here in Memphis, my counterpart at the University of Memphis, Aram Goodsouzian, and I started talking about what does it look like to put together an edited volume on the Black freedom struggle in Memphis, right? So that makes sense to me, right? In terms of that shift. I live in Memphis. The archives are here. There's a community of scholars here. So, okay, what do these moments of liberatory possibility look like in Memphis from Reconstruction down to Black Lives Matter, right? Down to the killing of Darius Stewart in 2015 in Memphis by the Memphis Police Department, right? So that's where I've been, right, for the last couple of years, all right? Well, at least since 2018 is liberatory possibility in Memphis, right? How can we, how do we chronicle that? How do we talk about it? How do we shape it and frame it? And so, so that's been a lot of the work that I've done recently. In the last few years, another edited volume's coming out, From Rights to Lives, co-edited with Francois Hamlin. Shout out to Francois, which is our attempt to place the Black Lives Matter moment in dialogue with the civil rights Black Power moment, right? What can we learn when we put these two moments of liberatory possibility in conversation with each other, right? Looking through the lens of Black Lives Matter, when we look back on the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, right? What did we miss in terms of our interpretive frames, in terms of the way in which we're theorizing about civil rights? And again, doing the same thing, thinking about notions of Black power, thinking about notions of leadership or self-defense or, the nature of social change. What does it look like? What does that look like? What does a contemporary moment look like refracted through that really complicated and complex lens of the 1950s and 60s? And so that's just kind of where I've been, right? Just sort of knocking around various iterations of this question about liberatory possibility.
Yeah. I'm glad I asked this question. I always like it when the undergraduate mentor and inspiration can get a little shout out, the way these teachers can cast such a beautifully long shadow. So
right.
It's just interesting to hear you talk about when you were talking about, I already know a good amount about your work, and then to hear you talk about the undergraduate moment for you, I was like, that sounds like you today. I love that. That's every teacher's dream,
Right. Right.
So I'm thinking about, the field of Black studies and just hearing you talk about this notion of liberatory possibility, which I love that phrase. That's a wonderful phrase. And I cannot wait for that edited volume. It's going to be right to the top of my reading list. I'm sure lots of people's too. But thinking about, this notion of liberatory possibility and politics and mobilization, I mean, that really gets to the origins of the field of Black studies as a university institution or department or a program, right? It's all of these kinds of things. Because, there's a popular sort of narrative, which it's popular for a reason, it's accurate, that Black studies was brought about through agitation, often very militant agitation and political demands by Black students to say a couple of things, right? We have no representation in the curriculum. We have no representation in these departments. Our experiences, our history, our expressive culture, our political demands all deserve a place, right, at these universities. And so I think a lot about that myself because it draws out, I don't know if I want to call it attention, because that I think prejudices this question a little bit too much, but definitely some kind of relationship between these two elements of Black studies that were there from the very beginning. It's political demands, right? Its need to document and articulate political programs and realities, and also what we could just call the Black intellectual tradition, understanding the centrality and significance of literature, art, music, and so forth. And so that difference between expressive culture and political agitation is really at the foundation of Black studies in its founding. And so I'm just interested in hearing you talk a little bit about the meaning and purpose of the field in relation to those two demands. So how do you think of the field in relation to those?
Man, that's a great question. So I'm going to date myself, right? Back in the day when you used to have a stereo in your car and the stereo had a graphic equalizer. And so you would have to.
Oh, that was fancy, man.
Yeah, it was fancy, right? I mean, I never had one of these, but I know other people who did, right? And so you had to adjust the levels, right, on your equalizer to get the type of sound that you wanted, right? So that's how I tend to think about Black studies, right? Is in this perpetual state of adjusting the levels to get the sound right. Right. We're constantly adjusting the levels to build the types of programs we want to build, but also probably more importantly, to build the types of programs that we can build.
Interesting.
Right. We have, all of us have particular sorts of aspirations around our programs, right? About what we want to be and where we want to go. And so I think part of the challenge, right, is how those aspirations are playing out in different types of institutions across the country, right? So, so the political demands, right? What is our relationship? What's our outward facing relationship to Black communities, right? Or to the larger city itself? How are those concerns articulated? Right. What form does that concern take? Right. Does it take, does that form, does it take the form of protests and interventions of particular sorts? Right. Does it take, is it a function of, right, sort of deep and substantive, to the extent that you can, right, deep and substantive sort of political engagement, right, beyond the walls of your institution, right? What does that look like? What can that look like? And then same thing with the intellectual tradition, right? What does it mean? What is the, how do we respond to, this really clarion call of the founders of the field, right? In terms, when you go back and think about, Anna Julia Cooper and Du Bois and, and all of these, Woodson, right? All of these OGs in the very beginnings, right? They're like, look, we're trying to construct this thing known as an intellectual tradition, right? We're trying to intentionally build a body of knowledge, right? And so then we move through time, we see people from all of these different sorts of disciplines, all of the different ways and modes of being, right? Who are engaged in that same activity, right? So, so it's singers, it's June Jordan, it's jazz musicians, it's critics, it's, right, it's blues musicians, right? It's, the traditional intellectuals and so on and so forth, right? And so this is where it gets beautiful and messy, right? In terms of, the relationship between these two things, right? Because they've always been, and this is one of the things that made Black studies so transgressive back in the day, right? Is that the porous relationship between those two things, right? Hey, we want to institutionalize an intellectual tradition that takes political struggle, right, that takes insurgency and resistance seriously. And that insurgency and resistance, we're not just reading about. This is not stuff that we're reading about. We're literally in the process of producing this insurgency, right? We're in the process of producing this resistance, right? And so in many ways, right, what you see a lot of, a lot of early scholars in the field, right, thinking, the late 1960s, early 1970s, right, is they're theorizing their own work, right? They're theorizing their own activities, right? Their own actions, because they're out in the thick of it, right? So, so that's the other thing that I think makes that moment so searing, right? And very intimate, and also very transgressive, right? For an American institution, for American institutions of higher learning that say, well, that's not how knowledge is produced, right? You got to be way more detached. You got to be way more quote unquote objective, whatever that is, right? This is not, this is not, right? This is not intellectual work, right? This is not, this ain't that, right? So, and so then that's also a part of the tradition, right? In terms of, right, answering that question, right, is what is our response to, right, this sort of institutional and disciplinary and intellectual rejection of a Black intellectual tradition, and that tradition's relationship with contemporaneous political demands, right? Yeah. What do we do with that, right? How do we combat that? How do we confront it? Do we combat it? Do we confront it? Do we care, right? About, about whether or not the people in philosophy and history and political science think what we're doing is legitimate, right? And so then this is where it gets back to, the levels, right? In terms of how we're negotiating and navigating these questions. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, right, is the ways in which we need to have much more nuanced conversations that recognize the different sorts of iterations, the different types of possibilities with regard to Black studies programs, right? So, Princeton and Berkeley and Harvard and Duke and Emory can have, can and probably are and should have particular sorts of conversations about their understanding of the construction of the endeavor, right? And what that looks like moving forward, right? And I can participate in those conversations. Rhodes College can participate in those conversations, but we're in a very different place, right? So, number of tenured faculty in Africana studies, 0, right? Most of the faculty who are affiliated, who are working in the endeavor are joint appointed between Africana studies and another department, right? So nobody's housed in the program. What does that mean for the program, right? Where is all this work taking place? Well, this work can take place in a couple of places then, right? That means then Africana studies can operate in in a very particular sort of way on my campus, right? Whereas, we're on other campuses, when if you've got 15 people housed in Africana studies, right? You can then also have both the political demands as well as the intellectual tradition in that space, right? You can think about the relationship of those two things, the synergies between those two things, the tensions between those two things, so on and so forth, right? But when you're at the small private liberal arts college and there's 5 affiliated faculty, right? Those political demands are dispersed, right? And the conversations about those political demands, they're dispersed across campus.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is also the other sort of double-edged phenomenon of the legacy of Black studies, right? Is Black people saying, hey, you know what? We need to take the lives of Black people seriously. We need to figure out what it means to transform institutions and communities and so on and so forth. So then what do you do when there's a couple of other spaces on your campus that say, yes, you're right. We should do that. Right. So then then what happens? Right. So then you're not the only game in town. Right. So that's the other thing that sort of happens. And so, so the political demands and the construction of that intellectual tradition in many places and spaces get decoupled. Right. In terms of, so then you have instances where on a whole host of campuses, right? The political demands being articulated and generated by Black Studies programs are being responded to across the campus, right? In a number of different spaces and places, right? So then the question becomes, okay, well, that's just sort of what it is, right? Mm-hmm. But about this intellectual tradition, right? That's much less likely to be dispersed across campus, right? Yeah. The legacy is political engagement and political activism, and the cultivation again of these liberatory moments of possibility, but the cultivation and the facilitation and the, and the honoring of, and the defense of, and the, and the production of courses and materials and writing about that intellectual tradition, that's more likely than not going to continue to be housed specifically in Black Studies programs. Right. So, again, that gets back to the levels, right? So, okay, there's 6 of us on campus. What's our most urgent endeavor? Right. How do we keep the program alive? How do we keep the program relevant? How do we do the work that we've been called to do as an Africana Studies program? Right. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, this is what that can look like. Right. It can look like this relentless pursuit of the intellectual tradition. Right. This relentless articulation of the intellectual tradition. The political demands. Yeah, we can do some of that work too. Right. But hey, there's just 5 of us. Right. Yeah. And we got other jobs. Right. And we also have other shit to do. Right. So, so again, right. I keep going back to the graphic equalizer analogy, but that's the tension. Right. And that wasn't ever anything that was going to be like resolved. Right. In terms of what that looks like. Right. As the nation in many places and spaces moves to the right, races to the right, sort of politically and culturally and so on and so forth. Right. Yeah. A lot of the articulations, a lot of those spaces of possibility also that we saw in the late 60s and early 70s. Right. The circumstances have changed in some really dramatic ways, right? So that's the other thing that I think we have to take into account in terms of, right, what an articulation of political demands can look like, sort of the multiplicity of those of those possibilities, but also, right, the multiplicity of possibilities when it comes to the articulation and cultivation of that intellectual tradition.
And I think there's so much interesting and so many interesting things you said. I mean, one thing that strikes me, thinking about this and listening to you talk is I think on a sort of first glance, people might think that an interest in the Black intellectual tradition is sort of depoliticized, whereas political demands around racial justice, especially responding to particular events, is more fraught and shocking. And Whenever I hear that sentiment, I always think about how upsetting it is to talk about, a jazz musician might be important for epistemology. I think about the nature and the generation and transmission of knowledge. Actually, people on campuses will lose their minds over that. Now, over political demands, the summer of 2020 and all the protests around the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders, in some ways, I mean, you can't generalize, but so many campuses, that was a mobilization to put resources into hiring Black faculty, enhancing curricula. I mean, it was sort of a 1 or 2 year program. But actually, and then that, as you say, we're racing to the right. And now I can't imagine making this kind of political demand without a huge fight. But that intellectual tradition seems to actually have its own kind of resilient, war. That making the demand that Du Bois be a part of everybody's curriculum, that Cooper be a part of people's curriculum, or that Black thought be represented across campuses is, in terms of campus politics, always extremely distressing to departments, right? And then you end up with the 5 of us, as you said, like the 5 of us or however many of us in a Black Studies department have to carry so much of that weight. But then, then how do the political demands, concrete political, urgent in the moment demands, Like, how do how does that politics play out in terms of our own growth, our own contraction, but also, as you say, our own workloads? I mean, it's amazing what in these kinds of moments, the demands that are put on Black Studies professors. I mean, just even in our moment, it's not a particular Black Studies question, although I understand the solidarity historically and sort of theoretically. But this moment around Israel and Gaza, I mean, the amount of requests and can we fund, can we support around that, the way that falls on a Black Studies department and not on a philosophy department, not on a public policy department, just always strikes me, as it's one of these really important ways of thinking about the legacy of Black Studies and its political struggle that sometimes I wonder, like, is this moment where we signed up for a lot more than maybe I realized I had signed up for when I switched fields?
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing, right, is, and this is sort of a recurring lesson, is, when we take the Black intellectual tradition seriously, there's actually a lot we can learn about, America. Right? Yeah. There's actually a lot we can learn about a whole bunch of stuff if we take this tradition seriously. Yep. Right? So, with the Palestine Gaza stuff, right? This long, we can look back to this long tradition of Black solidarity with Palestinian struggle for freedom and self-determination, right? Which is so firmly rooted in, right, an understanding of, black folk reading of, right, the perils and prospects of navigating a settler colonial state, right? Whether you are Black in South Africa or Black in Brazil or Black in, South Carolina, right, or New York, so there's a rich history. So there's a rich history there that people, sort of come back to, right? So a lot of, so there's some of us who know this history, right? And there's others in a moment like this, right? Particularly in the wake of the eruption over in the Middle East, right? This is also a moment of discovery for a bunch of folks, right? Yeah. Who were like, oh, wait a minute, right? Actually Martin King did have something to say about the Middle East, right? Oh, yes. Well, here's Malcolm, here's Nelson Mandela, right? Here's Kwame Ture, right? Here's this whole coterie of thinkers, right, who have already done this work of situating, right, Palestine in these larger global struggles for freedom and self-determination, right? Have situated Palestine in these larger conversations about the liberatory moments of possibility, right? And what those things look like. So it's like, yeah, you should turn to Black Studies for this, right? Because we've been talking about this for a while, right? Last night we had Blair Kelly come bless us here at Rhodes College, a historian. Shout out to Blair, a historian who now works at UNC Chapel Hill Center for the American Study the American South, and her new book is out called Black Folk, right? And it's about the Black working class, and it's this brilliant exploration of our families, of her family, right? Starting from the relative, the first relative they're able to trace from the 1820s, right? An enslaved, a brother living in, I think, either Georgia or North Carolina in the 1820s, right? And so all the way through the conversation around, Black laborers as essential workers and stuff like that, right? And so one of the things that she talked about last night is, when you take Black working class people seriously, then you have this much broader, wider, more nuanced, focused understanding of what it means to be working class, regardless of race, right, in 2024.
Yeah.
Right. So again, when you take the intellectual tradition seriously, and when you take the lives of, right, and the theoretical articulations and formulations of Black people seriously, you look up one day and you're like, oh, wow. Right. So, for instance, one of the things she was talking about last night, somebody asked her about, the great debate about race versus class. She's like, it's a false dichotomy. That's a ridiculous question. Right. That question literally doesn't make any sense. Right. When you think about how, right, the American labor terrain, the terrain of American labor is shaped in slavery. Right. is shaped in an institution of coercive extractive labor, right? So these poor indigent people were Black, right? So, so what are you even talking about, right? When you actually take the history of the country seriously, and when you center Black people in that history, right, then all of these sorts of political formulations that we're trying to, that politicians and other sorts of intellectuals are trying to make to score political points or to build political coalitions, whatever, those questions, they don't make any sense, right? You understand how ridiculous these questions actually are, right? Race versus class, right? I mean, what are you even talking about right now, right? In the context, again, and so also in the context of increasing immigration, right? More, these people, you got folks surging under the southern border, but you also have immigrants coming from Canada and Europe, right? And other places, right? That's one of the reasons the economy is doing as well as it's doing right now, is because of this massive influx of immigrants. And so from all across the world, right? So, so how do we make sense of this moment? Well, again, back to the books, right? Back to the things that we learned in an exploration of a Black intellectual tradition and the centrality, right, of working class people in the construction of that tradition, but also more broadly, right, the work of, the central role of Black folk in the construction of, right, the American economy, right, the construction of how we think about labor in this country, right, the construction of how we think about something called essential workers. Right? Who gets to stay home, right, with their kids, and who has to go to work, right? Who has to go unpack the groceries? Who has to go, right? Who has to go clean the hospitals, right? Who has to go to the food service place in the airports, right? All of this makes more sense if you take Black people more seriously, right? And so one of the great things about teaching in this moment, right, is you get to show this stuff to your students, right? You get to say, look, so many of these questions were answered by all of these luminaries years and years and years ago, right? Luminaries that you have not, that you have no idea who existed, right? Because of the segregated nature of your education, because of the fact that nobody was ever going to teach you about what Carter G. Woodson was actually trying to do in the 1920s and 1930s, right? Because nobody was ever going to actually teach you about June Jordan or W.B. Du Bois or any of these Black thinkers, right? No one was ever going to do that. And so what that means then is that you've missed out on all of these potential answers and insights and perspectives with regard to how we can be thinking about the contemporary moment, with regard to how we can be thinking about intellectual traditions, but also with regard to how we could be thinking about political demands, right? What did folks do before when they had demands? What did folks do before when there were massive levels of disconnection and alienation? What did folks do before in the midst of lynching, in the midst of Jim Crow, in the midst of slavery? Right, in the midst of an emerging struggle for human and civil rights, so on and so forth. Right. So, that's a long-winded answer, but that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I absolutely second your affection for Blair Kelly's book. It's fantastic. And by the way, I thought when I picked up the book and read it, it's an argument for simple titles. I just love this Black book. I was like, don't overthink titles, maybe, because when you don't it's a fantastic title and a great book. And I just, as a sort of side note, you're talking about, the way to discover that these things that a student or a young person or even any age person stumbles upon as an urgent issue, discovering it's been talked about. I have this happen in my classes a lot where students will be, their response will, when they identify their own struggles or their own questions and travails with, I don't know, Du Bois or Richard Wright or Zora Neale Hurston, and they'll say it's so sad that it continues to be relevant. But I always want to emphasize this is an intellectual tradition as well. It's like, well, we sometimes call that genius. Sometimes it's the genius that went and got this question and made it relevant for a century and a half. It's
right.
It's not always the persistent. It's not just the persistence of a particular political form,
right?
But let me ask you about your particular. You already talked a bit about your work and your interest in historical figures and places. And one of the things I really like about your Greater Freedom book is, because it's an interest I have generally, is how seriously it takes a small place. And by a small place, I mean, you're not talking about America, right? You're talking about a county, you're talking about a town, and the sort of what's happening in these kinds of places. And that's one of the things I really love about history, historical study. Right? I'm not an historian, but I love that about history. And I'm interested in that kind of work that you're doing, right? You said, you have this liberatory possibilities as this big overarching theme, but the way it's anchored in these particular places and particular figures, whether they're sort of underappreciated or understudied figures, thinking about North Carolina instead of everything always being about Selma, right? Or Memphis, or a particular moment in Memphis. So I'm curious how you see that kind of work that you've done and continue to do in relation to the past of Black studies. How do you think it connects to this question of origins, but also what Black studies has been, but also what do you think's the future lesson of that kind of work that you do? Like, what is it? How does it expand key elements in the field, but also allow us to connect to the past of the field?
That's a great question. So two things come to mind. One is sort of the work of excavation. And then the other thing is I'm thinking about evolution, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, there's a lot of energy out here in these academic streets, with regard to, right, an exhaustion of the archives, right? In terms of how we've got to go out and build, different types of archives to sort of get at the work of, to get at the nature, the stuff of Black life, right? Of Black thought, culture, so on and so forth. And I'm in no way, shape, or form disputing that, because I think that's absolutely right? You've got to, we've got to, and this is, again, God bless Black studies, right? Is we've got to have sort of different archival chops to go out and tease out Black life and all of the ways that we seek to tease out Black life. So I think that's absolutely right. But there's also, right, there's also just a whole bunch of stuff that's still in the archives that is readily available and accessible that we just have not accessed yet with regard to Black folks, right? So I live in Memphis, Tennessee, and one of my colleagues said when I first got here, he just sort of was off the hand comment. He was like, one of the things you're going to discover, Chuck, is that Memphis, Tennessee is one of the most under-researched major cities in the country. And I didn't give much thought to this comment at the time because I was in the process of finishing up my book on North Carolina, right? So I was like, I don't give a damn about Memphis right now. I'm trying to finish his book so I can keep my job. But then when I moved over and started doing work on Memphis, I was like, oh my God, he is absolutely right. This is one of the most under-researched major cities in the country. So then what does that mean? It means that all of this work, like pick an area, right? Pick a field, pick a moment, pick a decade, pick a century, right? Black life in that moment has been under-researched, right? There is no definitive work on the NAACP in Memphis, Tennessee, right? That book literally has not, one of the most storied, stage sort of traditional, right? There's books on the national NAACP, there's books on the NAACP in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, But a book on the largest NAACP chapter in the state in the 1950s and 60s, and one of the largest chapters in the nation at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, no one's written that book yet, right? All of the papers are sitting over in the Benjamin Hooks Library. And so my point is, right, there's a whole bunch of work to do, right? And so we always have to be, this gets back to the levels, right? In terms of, right, the ways in which, you know, a lot of scholars are talking about sort of an exhaustion of the archives and how we've got to start thinking about new ways of reading these materials and stuff like that. And I think, yes, and, right? But also, these NAACP papers are sitting over here. And, you know, and aside from a couple of graduate students, I know James Conway, shout out to James Conway, who's working on his book on the NAACP. So that's going to be, looking forward to that happening, right? So all of this is to say, right, my thinking about, right, sort of the relationship between history and Black studies, it gets back to this imperative of excavation, right?
Yeah.
The imperative of, there's so much that we don't know about Black folk, right? About how they think, about how they lived, about how they organized their lives, so on and so forth. We've come a long way, right? 2024 is not 1924, right? Is not 1944, is not 1964. So clearly we've made leaps and bounds, right? In terms of strides, in terms of, right, you know, the rendering of Black life, particularly in the last 50 years. And there's way more work to do, right? There's so much more work to do. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about the relationship between these two things, is that common endeavor, right? That common imperative to excavate Black life, right? In the service of a discipline, right? In the service of history, you know, and a whole bunch of Black studies folk will be like, you know, history, you know, disciplines, right? You know, that's fine, but, you know, history ain't going anywhere. So yes, in the service of history, but also in the service of Black studies. And obviously and clearly those two things are not, you know, mutually exclusive, right? There's a deep and abiding and very intimate concentric area between those two fields, which gets to my thinking in terms of evolution, right? The way I think about the excavation of Black life in 2024 is markedly different from the way I was thinking about the excavation of Black life when I first got to Rhodes, right? Or when I was in graduate school. You know, I got a graduate certificate in AAAS at Duke, right? African and African American Studies. And being in a history department, you know, and being the lone sort of African American history person, right? You know, so I'm in charge of who teaches slavery, McKinney, who teaches civil rights, McKinney. It's like that old cartoon, you know, first base, Bugs Bunny, second base, Bugs Bunny, third base, Bugs Bunny, right? You know, all things African American history. That was me, right? So, you know, okay, I got to do the job. I got to work up all these classes, history. But the evolution is, right, you know, we decided a number of years ago to shift the program here on campus from African American studies to Africana studies, right? Because of the presence, and we were so thankful for this, because of an increased presence of folks who studied Black life outside of the United States, right? You know, I got a colleague in international studies who does African politics, right? You know, thinking about Black nationalism as it's articulated in Africa. A colleague who does Francophone literature, right? Francophone African literature. A colleague who does Caribbean literature, right? Another colleague who's thinking about, right, you know, Spanish speaking Black folk out, you know, in the diasporic implications of Spanish speakers, so on and so forth, right? So, you know, a colleague who teaches African history. So we were like, oh, clearly it's time for us to make this shift, which was also aspirational in terms of, you know, we can't just be Africana studies, right? The program has to evolve to reflect the capacious nature of Black life, right? And so that shift a number of years ago, around that same time, I started asking really serious questions of my own scholarship, right? In terms of how is Black studies seasoning? How is Black studies sort of challenging and encouraging me? How is Black studies helping me to evolve as a scholar?
Yeah.
Right. And so the answer to that, right, is thinking about these moments of liberatory possibility, being way more open, right, to all of these different sorts of inputs, right? So, it's so much more than, well, who came to the meeting, right?
Yeah.
Who made the protest sign, right? Who stood in opposition to this, so on and so forth, right? So now I'm thinking about questions like, I'm thinking about, Shauna Redmond's in my ear and Regina Bradley's in my ear. Like, what does freedom sound like, right? What do moments of liberatory possibility sound like? How are they being rendered? Right? How are people talking about, what spaces are people talking about these moments? And what do these moments look like? What does sanctuary look like? Oh, well then, I got to move beyond the political meetings. I got to move beyond all of the sort of the usual places and spaces that historians are accessing to make sense of, right? Political change, political mobilization, change over time, so on and so forth, right? So those, so that intellectual endeavor, right? The endeavor that I was pursuing as a graduate student and in my early years here, right, is no longer adequate for me, right? Because I know now that I've got to think through and think about, right, a much more sort of capacious, number of categories, right, with regard to, right, nailing down Black thought, Black life, right? Black activity, right? Nailing down, again, these liberatory movements of possibility, because those movements exist in so many different ways and in so many different places, right? And that's what Black studies has sort of done for me, right? In terms of how I think about history and how I think about the construction of history. Right now, there's going to be a debate amongst people in terms of, well, it's still not Black studies. And I'm not necessarily making that argument. But what I am saying is, right, we do have to take into account the ways in which Black studies are shaping the methodological and theoretical choices, right, that historians and other folks housed in disciplines are making. Right. So when you think about the work of Vince Brown, when you think about the work of Jennifer Morgan, when you think about, right, J.T. Roan's work on Philadelphia, when you think about all of these folks, some of whom are operating in discipline, some of whom are not, who are so clearly impacted and influenced, right, by Black studies, right? You have to give an account for that, right, in terms of, right, and again, in terms of the impact of this intellectual tradition. And then in terms of the way that intellectual tradition is going to be made manifest, even in places that aren't Black studies. Yeah. Right. So the other thing, right. Don't tell my boss. Right. But, 50% of the classes that I teach, they're housed in the history department, but they're Africana studies classes. Yeah. Right. I mean, this history literature and the Black experience, history literature. I'm all over the place in that class. And we might read some history, right? And so again, right? So Black studies is doing so much work, both within Black studies departments and programs, but also outside of Black studies departments and programs. Yeah.
It's interesting to me to think about, a lot of what you were saying, about, sort of more capacious notion of Blackness and thinking about Black life, and the names of departments. My department just renamed itself. We've been African American Studies since, I think, 1971. And we had conversation about changing the name. And I have to admit, I don't know why I thought this, but I thought this was just going to be a sort of more of a branding talk, or more to talk about how to have a resonance with the profession, maybe, but also with students. But it turned into this deep discussion of what we mean by the field, right? And so now it's African American and Africana. It's a sort of compromise. Just, not to tell the business of department meetings, there were some people deeply invested in the African American part. And, but then, of course, we have people working in the Caribbean, Africa, Afro-Latino studies. But the way just the naming of a department surfaces so much about how we understand intellectual inquiry and the intellectual life of the study of Black people. It's just, the way you can do it just in how do you name a department is pretty amazing. It also means people get very tense. It's is it was a little, for me, it was a little bit like, I've always wondered why, alumni or fans of sports teams melt down over mascots. What's the name of my undergraduate were the Chieftains and now we're the Red Hawks because I was it's just a terrible thing to be, have the faces of indigenous people as your mascot. But I was like, this is actually where the sort of name of something is of deep, deep consequence too. Whether it is Africana, whether it is Black Studies or African American Studies. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea that Memphis is understudied, I mean, I lived there for years. I was a doctoral student in the city. This is outrageous and strange. But as you said, it's also possibility. And I think that's the important part.
Yeah. And I think when we take the pursuit and the construction of the intellectual tradition, when we take that part of this work seriously, right, then I think we have to be open to all of the sort of the various iterations of what that can look like, right? There's folks in departments across campus who are doing some great work to excavate the Black intellectual tradition, right? Shout out to Earl Wright over in anthropology sociology, who's doing this amazing work on Du Bois, right, in the Atlanta University School of Sociology, and the ways in which that school is sort of foundationally situated, and in the institutional and structural, barriers placed in their way in terms of sort of national recognition of this really early work, right? So that's foundational sociological work that Earl Wright is doing. But it's foundational sociological work that has broad implications, right? Not just for sociology, but certainly also, right? Africana and Black Studies, right? In terms of, hey, here's one of our founders, right? And here are the ways, right? And here's a fuller telling of that story, right? Of the work that he was putting in at Atlanta University, right? Which was just monumental, right? Here's the work that he was putting in, and here are the very specific ways that work was stifled, right? By folks in Chicago and some other places, so on and so forth, right? So, there are some folks who were like, I don't have a horse in this whole Du Bois founder of sociology thing, whatever. So some folks are pretty ambivalent about that stuff. But, the historians are like, well, this is the story. Yeah. Right? And a bunch of other people like, look, this is the story, right? This has much broader implications for, right, the trajectories of that intellectual tradition, right? And this opens up the possibility for us to talk about the ways in which that tradition is being explicitly and actively stifled, right? Which is also a part of the story of the history of the intellectual tradition in the country, of the Black intellectual tradition in the country, right? So, so that sociological work has historical implications, and it certainly has implications for Black studies. Right. It has implications for, right, what do we do with particular bodies of knowledge? What is our response? What is our reaction to particular bodies of knowledge? Right. So, OK, so here's the question with regard to Du Bois. Right. Here's another question with regard to, right, Black women making particular sorts of articulations about their lives and their experiences. Right. What do we do at this moment? Right. In the midst of this really masculinist endeavor, right, known as, the Black freedom struggle, civil rights, Black power, so on and so forth, right? So there's all these moments where, this work that's being done in many instances outside of Black studies is going to be directly relevant to how we think about Black studies in this moment.
So you've touched on as sort of winding down the conversation, let me ask you another big speculative question that's opened up by, where you've gone here in terms of disciplines and area studies, right? Black studies, but also history or sociology. So in imagining the future of Black studies, I think 50 years is a nice number to start to think about, like, what are the next 50 years? Sort of what are the aspirations of the field? This sort of, for me, not sort of, there are two drastic paths. So maybe, this is too binary. But one, I think about the founding of Black Studies as at once the idea that we could develop methodologies in the field that are specific to Black Studies. And so it would be taking, existing, methods and forms of knowledge from people like Du Bois and Hurston and so forth, and making that a Black Studies methodology, a Black Studies approach to understanding intellectual life, expressive culture, politics, and so forth. And then there is sort of on the other side of that, which is the question of it's lonely to be the one person in, say, an English department in 1970 who worked on African American literature. Now you can come to Black Studies and you could just talk about Black literature without having to constantly justify that this is literature, right? And one of the things that I think that let's establish the second sort of vision of let's establish that, say, Black art, Black literature, Black philosophy, Black history are all important. One way to take that is that eventually the point of Black Studies is to not have Black Studies, to establish in a Black Studies field the legitimacy of, say, the historical study of Black life, so that then history departments are radically different in 100, 150 years. But that's very different than the vision of Black Studies as its own methodologies, where it becomes its own field, almost its own discipline. And so I'm thinking just in terms of this big speculative question about the future of Black Studies, what are your thoughts on these sort of two different directions? In other words, is the point of the field of Black Studies to eventually dissolve itself and to disrupt and overturn the disciplines so that they never look the same in the future? Or is it to really be something akin to a discipline that never gets reabsorbed by those disciplines because it really just is a different approach to scholarship and knowledge?
Wow, that is a big question. So, 50 years ahead, I think we'll still be on these two, for lack of a better word, dueling tracks, right? I think I can see, because we see it now, right? In terms of, all of these colleges and universities who've created these, self-conscious, units, these explicitly, Black Studies, right? Here in Maryland, there at Maryland and at Rhodes and Harvard, Princeton, you got Wayne State, so on and so forth. And I don't necessarily see that going anywhere, right? And I also don't see the ways in which Black Studies are impacting other departments. I don't necessarily see that going anywhere either, right? But I think the overarching, so for me, the overarching question is, right, just, what's going to be the shape and nature of the American Academy in 50 years, right?
Yeah.
What are American colleges and universities going to look like in 50 years, right? And so then in the event that, right, this thing is, we've been talking about, American higher education is crumbling for the last 100 years, right? It's going to hell in a handbasket, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. Well, if it actually is going to hell in a handbasket, right? Then, the answer to this question, again, is contained in, right, the earliest iterations of Black Studies, right? And here I'm thinking about, this first generation of, right, that generation of scholars who were literally coming online in the first 3-4 decades of the 20th century, who knew and understood that Black study, was never actually meant to be housed solely and specifically in institutions of higher education.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Carter G. Woodson was like, hey, you know what? We're going to create the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History at libraries, churches, right? Amongst fraternity and sorority members, amongst, Elks Lodge members, so on and so forth. The Memphis chapter of ASALH, right now in 2024 has got nothing to do with any college or university, right? The chapter in Jacksonville, Florida has got nothing to do with any colleges or universities, right? So
Love that.
Because they knew and understood back in the day, they're like, why would we do that? Right? These institutions don't have our best interests at heart. And these are predominantly white institutions, right? They don't have our best interests at heart. They have no interest or desire in housing or facilitating anything related to anything regarding Black life, right? So that's one of the other lessons that I think we have to be really serious about contending with when it comes to thinking about the future of Black studies, right? Is the future of Black studies necessarily does the future of Black studies necessarily have to be tasked to institutions of higher education, right? Do we have to stay on that boat? Which then also gets back to this other question around, right, the legacy of political demand and the legacy of how Black studies thinks of itself and thinks of its relationship with people outside of the academy. This is another one of the reasons, right, that folks outside of the academy were so crucial to Black studies in those early years, because that's where Black studies was being practiced, right? We get to study Black people over here at Earl's auto shop, right? A bunch of people gathered, a bunch of people after Earl is finished changing these tires, we get to sit in the back of Earl's shop, right? And read Du Bois and read some plays and read some poems, right? That's where Black studies that's also a place where Black studies was happening, right? That's also a place where Black studies was being performed, was being conducted, was being housed, right? All of these places and spaces that had nothing to do with the academy, that had nothing to do with higher education, right? And so, so that's the thing that I think about, right? Is, the extent to which Black studies is going to be able, right? The extent to which Black studies should, in fact, right, be thinking about what does it mean to exist and be vibrant and be relevant and be alive in the lives of students, right, in the lives of faculty, but to do that work decoupled from the institution, right? Decoupled from whether or not I get tenure, right? Decoupled from committee work and all of that other stuff.
Yeah. I love that. It's maybe my last question I wanted to ask you. I mean, maybe you've given an answer to it. Because I wanted to conclude by saying, whatever we imagine or whatever happens with our vision of the future of Black studies in an institutional context, I was just curious to hear, as a sort of last thought, what are the questions that you think are most urgent and that you think we should all be asking?
Urgent questions that we should all be asking. What does it mean to sustain Black studies in this moment? Right? What does that sustaining look like? Right? And there's got to be multiple answers to that question. Right? So that's probably the central question. The biggest question for me, right, is what does that sustaining look like? And just like Black studies, a century ago, right, we're gonna have to be nimble on our feet, right, with regard to the ways in which that question is being answered. I mean, we live in a time now where hey, the DEI office is being shuttered because it's now officially against the law. Right.
It's wild.
It's ridiculous. Right. But this is, but if we think this is crazy, right, and Mary McLeod Bethune would like to have a word.
Yeah.
Right. As would the scholars of the first 5 decades of the 20th century. Right. I mean, so and because that's the other lesson, right, is, what, this is not, we've never been here before. No, we have. Right. And that's the other thing that Black studies can remind us, right, is no, this is where we were before. Right. And so And so again, we've got answers to this question. The question becomes the extent to which we're prepared to replicate those answers in the service of Black studies.
I love that. Perfect place to conclude this. This is really brilliant. I'm so glad we had a chance to talk. Super interesting. I'm gonna be thinking about this all evening and for the rest of the week. So I really appreciate that you took the time. And I love hearing your thoughts on this. And I should have said it at the beginning, but I'll say it at the end. Congratulations on what seems to be a really flourishing, fresh new Africana studies program there at Rhodes College. I know you put in countless hours of work along with your colleagues, and it's a wonderful thing so that you can not only talk and think about how do we sustain this, but actually be someone who sustains it in an understudied city, unbelievably enough.
Right.
The city of Memphis, sustaining that. So thanks for that work, and thanks so much for your thoughts. I appreciate that.
Thank you, brother. Pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Take care.